So I want to provide an overview of my findings from the Human Health Risk Assessment chapter for this particular area. And I'll get into that without much preamble, and I'll talk about the things that I found in the TransCanada reports from the extent that I could review them. And if there's appetite for more information, then I can also talk about human health risk assessment, give you essentially a primer on what that is and what it can and can't do. And then also talk about the whole process of environmental impact assessments. And I think that gets down to the crux of many of the real issues here. So I'll start off with my findings first of all, and then we'll take it from there, depending on what your desire for information is. So what I found looking at that chapter, it's a very short chapter, it's about 28 pages. Sure. Excellent. Yeah. It's about 28 pages long, and which is very short for a human health risk assessment. There's another one that I'm going to be reviewing very soon. The main chapter is 300 and some pages, and the appendix is over 1,200. So 28 pages is short. The scope is very limited. It's limited to the construction and operation of the tanks and the marine terminal. So there's no mention of leaks, spills, fires, any catastrophic kind of issues. There is mention.
What's the name of the document? The document.
Oh, it's the Energy East document. The Energy East.
Environmental assessment.
Yeah, the Human Health Environmental Assessment or Human Health Risk Assessment.
Thank you.
There's a reference to it in the paper on your seat there, and there's a footnote and a direct website address for the NEB document.
Sorry.
That's okay. Other questions, just interrupt. It'll take me a couple of seconds to reorient, and then I'll keep going. So there isn't a discussion of the catastrophic events, and there is mention in the chapter that there would be an addendum to their volume 6, which is the discussion of catastrophic events, leaks and spills, that would look at the human health risk assessment. But that hasn't appeared yet. The list of chemicals is limited to volatile organic chemicals, so only compounds that are emitted into the air from the tanks or from loading the vessels at the terminal. From my perspective, that may be an adequate number of chemicals to look at, but the discussion on how they chose those chemicals is essentially non-existent. There's one paragraph of saying these are the compounds we looked at, and there's no description or discussion of why they limited the compounds to that. When I think about the vapor combustion units, or capturing and oxidation units, they like to call it, it's essentially a flare. There will always be compounds of incomplete combustion that come from those. So by calling it an oxidation unit, they can use some language that sort of muffles the issue a little bit. And I think there would be compounds to at least consider from that perspective, including compounds like PAHs. Another thing that I saw fairly quickly is that there needs to be a more clarity on selection of guidelines, and the guideline for benzene was the one that popped out. Benzene guideline, the one they use is the Alberta Ambient Air Quality Guideline, or Ambient Air Quality Objective. For other compounds, they'll choose the Ontario guideline, but for benzene they did not. And it's interesting because the benzene guideline is for the Alberta guideline, it's 3 micrograms per cubic meter for a annual average, and the Ontario one is about 10 times less than that at 0.45. So having a discussion of why they chose one over the other is certainly relevant. And then finally, from the overall ones, more clarity on how they define significant versus non-significant. They do have a table and a series of points that they go through to I guess, go through their matrix to decide whether something is going to be significant or not significant. Number one on the chemical side is if it doesn't exceed any guidelines, then it won't be significant. And so the choice of a guideline from Alberta versus Ontario for benzene, in one case it would exceed the guideline, in the other case it does not. The other aspect that I saw in there for significance versus non-significance is the effect reversible or not. And in this case, they say it's reversible when the project closes down, but that's 40 years from now. So if you're talking about being exposed to something, whatever it is, for 40 years, and then you shut it down, well, that's almost 2 generations of people living here. So there needs to be some transparency, some more discussion on that. So I mentioned the benzene thing already. So all of this is done by modeling, computer modeling of the contaminants that they expect would be emitted from various places around the tanks and during the loading and during the piping and transfer and all that. So for the St. John area, looking at the different places where they've done the modeling, they estimate an annual average of 0.74 micrograms per cubic meter. And the project contribution, if you look at the project on its own, would be quite a bit smaller than that. It's 0.0028, which the numbers may not mean anything in and of themselves. As I said, the Alberta ambient air quality objective is 3, whereas the Ontario one is 0.45. So clearly the 0.74 is above the Ontario guideline. And then for some perspective, I found some data on Canadian averages, Canadian values, and concentrations of benzene have come down quite a bit since the 90s. It's been looked at and regulated more strictly over the past couple of decades. So in the 1990s, it was above 3 micrograms per cubic meter in many cities. Now it's down to about 0.9. So the model estimate for St. John it's in the range 0.8, 0.9. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the models that are used. The air quality models, and this is not my primary area of expertise, but I've always used the data from these air contaminant models, and I've always questioned how they derive the data, how they get to it, and what the uncertainties are. So this big computer model will look at the weather, the meteorology, the contaminants. It's a big mixing pot of chemicals and air and wind and currents and everything else. And so you can imagine there's a lot of guesstimates in there. It's a very complex modeling, kind of complex computing, and it's a challenge to get real information about what kind of uncertainty is in that model, what kind of uncertainty is in the results that come out of that. And the challenge with that is that as a risk assessor, I use the numbers that come out of the model to help me decide, is something going to be reasonably safe for human health or less safe. So the nearest that I can determine, and what's been told to me by some people who use the model, is that in general it's about plus or minus 2 times is the accuracy. And that could vary even more, so plus or minus 5 times. Some people say order of magnitude, which is 10 times. So what's the implication of that uncertainty? we really don't know. In these kind of EIAs, there isn't a discussion of that kind of uncertainty. We get tables and tables of data, and they're extremely precise numbers, but the precision of those numbers really doesn't matter. It's misleading in the sense that they could be 2 times higher, 2 times lower, 5 times higher, 5 times lower. The accidents and spills, leaks, what I call catastrophic events. They did look at those kinds of things for the pipeline, per se, in terms of engineering risks. And so they looked at data from a couple of databases in Canada and the US. It wasn't just the TransCanada corporate database. It was, I forget what the databases are called.
It's the US one.
Yeah. So they calculate a risk of approximately 1 leak in 2,500 years per kilometer of pipeline, and there's no discussion about the tanks or the terminal. So when you calculate a risk like that, then the corporate perspective is to say, well, it's a very small risk, so we really don't need to be worried about it. So we don't need to evaluate it further. But we know that leaks and catastrophic events happen. We've got the Michigan diluted bitumen spill from 2010 that spilled, I think it was 5 million liters of diluted bitumen down a creek, and the events that had to come together for that to happen were unusual. And if the engineers or others had done their calculations on the odds of that happening, they would have been extremely small. But they did happen, and they will happen again. So it's, in terms of transparency and intellectual honesty, it's simply acknowledging that things can happen, and then evaluating what are the consequences and what could the consequences be. A couple other major pipelines, the Northern Gateway Pipeline and the Trans Mountain Pipeline in BC from Alberta to the BC coast, they've had to look at catastrophic spills inland as well as in the marine terminal, like in the Westminster, Burnaby area. So they were required to submit risk assessments for those. And granted, they did not do that on the first run. They waited until they were basically told to do it. And in this case, we need to tell NEB that's a requirement. So the other thing that is a large gap, I think, is the odors. If they talk about VOCs, volatile organic compounds, there will be other volatile compounds, hydrogen sulfide, other hydrogen or reduced sulfur containing compounds, the rotten egg smells, the skunk smells, the nasty ones. Those aren't addressed in this document at all. And the implied perspective is that they do look at some of the compounds from a emission standpoint, and some of these compounds have an odor-based regulatory limit. But that's not the same as evaluating odors from a facility. And there's a very complex relationship between odors and health outcomes. We can think back to the 1980s and early 1990s with sick building syndrome. Things like odors and volatile compounds that led to a whole series of different types of health effects, and some very debilitating health effects. And doctors telling people, well, it's all in your head, because they couldn't find anything. They couldn't see anything, they couldn't smell anything, but other people could. So in a community around Peace River, Alberta, there's a heavy oil facility. They were producing heavy oil using steam underground, and they pump up an emulsion, and then they put that in heated tanks to break up the emulsion. And those tanks needed to be vented because the heated oil and water emulsion. And for some reason, they thought it was wise or acceptable to vent these tanks just to the air. And so, of course, the farmers in the area were exposed to the vapors that came out of there, and they had a long battle to try and get it addressed, and even their doctors really didn't believe them that there was something that they could do about it. Ultimately, some families needed to move away from their farms, and they found that when they moved away from their farms for 2 weeks and then went back for a day, the symptoms would all reappear, and so ultimately they just had to leave. That case went before the Alberta Energy Regulator, and in part because of that, and in part because of other things, there's now a good practices guide for water management in Alberta, and that was put out by the CASA group, Clean Air Society for Alberta, I believe. So that's a very good document that talks about odors, talks about monitoring and managing odors. And one of the crucial things here is that none of the air quality guidelines were being exceeded in this whole area. They were well below guidelines on all kinds of things that we can measure. So even if the company is achieving guidelines, there's still things that can happen to people's health. So we need a well-designed monitoring program, and monitoring for odors, both chemically as well as symptomatically, and having healthcare professionals who understand that things can be very difficult to narrow down to one particular thing or another. So a series of questions for TransCanada. Number one would be to update the human health risk assessment for relevant catastrophic events. The other one would be to provide an odor assessment and an odor monitoring and assessment approach, and a commitment to having a plan if people start noticing things, if people start feeling ill, having different kinds of symptoms, headaches, whatever. It's far too easy for corporations to say, well, it's all in your head. You're just imagining it. We also need to clarify, or they should clarify, why the Alberta guideline was used for benzene and not the Ontario guideline. I could speculate, but that's not my job. They're the ones who are using it, so they should explain why they're using that guideline and not the other. And in conjunction with that, as well as the modeling of the compounds, what are the implications of uncertainties in the model? And that's a challenging one, because I often had that discussion with the engineers or the scientists who are doing the modeling, and that question just sort of goes whoosh. I don't really understand it. So some of those kind of questions they're a challenge to answer, which is why they aren't in the report in the first place, why they haven't addressed them in the first place. So I'll take a break here and ask for any questions. Oh, lots of questions, okay. I presume the mic is standing here so that everyone can